All right. Hi, everybody. This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie, a show where I talk with the artists, entrepreneurs, politicians, policymakers, and visionaries who are making the world more libertarian, or at least more interesting by challenging worn-out old orthodoxies and ideas. Today, we're doing a special live edition with my longtime Reason colleague and sometimes co-author Matt Welch. Matt, thanks for talking.
Thank you for having me, Nick. And I regret that we can't just talk about Gorman Thomas for the next episode, but we'll
No, we can't. We're talking, on 9/11, which is a day that lives in infamy, the largest act of political terrorism, or terrorism, I guess, on American soil. Obviously happened in 2001. And then yesterday, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. The topic today is political violence. And Matt, I guess the first question that I want to talk about with you is, are we in an era of heightened political violence? And if so, how do we know that?
I presume that we are, without having the handy-dandy spreadsheet that Reason writers like Jesse Walker and others like to go to whenever we talk about mass shootings and other things.
Right.
Just that, you and I both became teenagers at the end of that era of assassination. Basically, Ronald Reagan was the last major assassination attempt after a really long and awful series, basically between 1963 and 1981. I would even add John Lennon to that, not necessarily political.
No, it's not political, but it's definitely violent. Yeah,
it was just, there was this violence, this ambient violence, like it was, planes might get hijacked at any given time. There'd be bombs going off in New York City. I forget what the number is at the height of the 1970s madness, but I think it's more than a bomb a day. Just whatever, like Croatian separatist movement was setting off bombs. So that period was part of our childhoods all the way until it wasn't. Much like rushing the field after the ALCS happened, and then suddenly it stopped happening. And then even if you just do cursory research, even if you don't have a rigorous methodology of political assassinations, assassination attempts, and political violence in the U.S., you will see that period, the 63-81 period, the productive Rolling Stones era period of political violence produced all of this. And then there's a pretty long lull, and then it starts kicking back up right around the time of the congressional shooting of Steve Scalise, 2016, 2017.
Yeah, I want to challenge that timeline a little bit, and I do think that we're in a heightened moment of political violence, but also, one thing is, I did a quick look, or, a quick remembrance of FDR, Truman, JFK, Ford twice, Reagan, Clinton was not actually shot at, but the White House was shot at several times, and a couple of people were caught running up the White House, the backyard with guns. Trump, there's, if we're talking about presidential assassination attempts, there's some gaps, but it's also there's almost a rhythm to it. I will also just compliment or complicate your timeline about something happens after Reagan is shot, right? And, but then in the 90s, there is Oklahoma City. There are massive abortion bombings, many of which were the work of Eric Rudolph, but others not. Abortion doctors being killed. When I was in Buffalo, I believe, or right after I left, that happened. So there is, there are these spasms of political violence, right?
Yes,
and it seemed, and
is definitely worthy of. That we, as we were living as a country through the mid '90s, we thought, or we reported on that being an era of heightened political violence.
And the first Trade Center bombing in '93 as well. So I guess one of the things that I kind of want to ask, because I do, and again, I just did a real quick kind of scan of recent stuff. In August, there was the guy who shot up the CDC. There were the Minnesota state senator who was killed, and her husband, and another one injured, him and his wife. There was the arson in April, the attempted arson at Shapiro's house in Pennsylvania. The Israeli embassy, 2 staffers were killed outside of that in D.C. There was a Palm Springs IVF bombing. A car blew up outside of it. The FBI was treating that as a politically motivated or ideologically motivated. In June, in Boulder, Colorado, there was the flamethrower attack that happened at a pro-Israel parade. Obviously, Brian Thompson was shot by Luigi Mangione in recent memory. And, on New Year's Day in New Orleans, there was the truck, running people over, during New Year's Day celebration. And then if you click back a little bit more, and this is kind of relevant because a lot of people are talking about it, when Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, was attacked at home, and that's widely considered to have been an attempted kidnapping of Nancy Pelosi, who wasn't there. So, I mean, it seems like violence is heightened. I don't know, like you were, I think, saying, like, I don't know if we can show statistically that things are happening more rather than less. I've read accounts saying they are, but a lot of these times these are from extremism centers, which are always kind of coming up with ways of saying things are worse and worse. But I'm reminded, and I think I shared this with you before we went online, from 1969, H. Rap Brown, the Black Power figure, talked about how violence is as American as cherry pie. And he was, in a way, that was ushering in that post late 60s, early 70s era of violence, where it just seemed revolutionary violence was everywhere. Yeah. So we're probably
1969 is part of that. Like it's possible to just, like, one of the best top 10 all-time Reason video is Attack Ads circa 1800, which starts with a bunch of Obama type people and media people saying it's terrible out there. People are making these are the worst political climate we had. And we're like, crack open a history book and let's go back to 1800. And then there's a lot of hilarious voices and animations, and like, it's funny, it's right, it's true. And also, I don't want to go back to 1800. That was a really bad campaign. Yeah. Like, we shouldn't want that. People back then would duel each other and then, like, kill each other. That's not really like a thing to go to. So I think part of the reason that people are under the impression that there's more political violence is that the way that we talk about politics and violence feels different than it did 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. So can we talk about that a little bit in terms of, like, why is that? And actually, even before we start with that, can we say that the murder of Charlie Kirk, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, is it categorically different, or does it read different? And just to put it in a context, the woman, the Ukrainian woman who was killed on the Charlotte subway, or the light rail system, like, that is horrifying. Part of what makes it so horrifying is that there is video of it that is widely circulated. I think we can say that is not political violence, right? It does not seem.
No, it's not. It's not. The violence is politicized, as violence often is, right? Cameras running, but that's completely separate. It's not that someone went to a political rally, aimed a gun, a rifle, at a known political actor, and successfully executed him. That is it is a political act, regardless of whatever we figure out the actual motivation is. I mean, you don't know who Charlie Kirk is unless you're marinating in a certain amount of politics. And so that person went there to kill someone in a political act that day,
and went to kill him, right? I mean, like, there's no. I mean, we don't know who the shooter is. It's odd. We know essentially nothing about Trump's shooter, which is frustrating, because maybe it would give us some insight, maybe not. I mean, one of the things that is amazing is that when you think about people like the two women, Squeaky Fromm, who was a member of the Manson family, and Sarah Jane Moore, who both shot at Ford within a couple weeks of each other, they were nuts. Like, I mean, there was no clear ideological motivation. Same thing with John Hinckley Jr. right? I mean, he was doing it for the love of Jodie Foster. So it may be that we find out what the shooter was thinking who went after Kirk, or we find out what Trump's shooter was, and it may not matter, right, at all. It may just be like it's a nut who has done this. I mean, it's not even Oswald is not, it's not exactly clear what Oswald was doing and why.
Soviet agent, like I don't tend to overthink JFK, but in this case and in similar cases, there is I think a strong possibility that the political fixations of the moment, like people, nutbags with guns, are going to gravitate towards things that are generating heat and light. One of the reasons why we think that we're living through an era of political violence are a couple of things that we didn't talk about in your list, which is the summer of 2020 and related protests, Portland, Oregon, being kind of a scene of actual sort of street battles, at least on those very few occasions when Patriot Prayer would go and march. But I mean, a guy was executed on the streets of Portland. It gets kind of forgotten, but that happened in real time. There were a lot of clashes in Trump's first administration in Washington, D.C. Rand Paul would come from a restaurant and get completely hounded. And part of the way that people talked about it was like in spaces where journalists lived, like Twitter back in the day before they discovered Blue Sky. It was, well, what do you expect? These people can't have peace. Look at what they're doing to us. There was this sort of system of justification for it, and levels of discourse about this. And we saw this obviously with Luigi Mangione and some of the discourse around that. That was startling because it's not the same that we remember from discussions about this 10, 15 years ago. Part of this is because we sadly have access to everyone's innermost lousy thoughts in ways that are more than we did 15 years ago. But to see this among people who work in politics or who are journalists is jarring. And I think it's part of the kind of there are no kind of guardrails left. But an aspect of reason why I think it's worth considering that we live in a more violent moment is January 6th. That's a violent act that happened against the Capitol on the day that they were supposed to certify an election, after a rally that Trump spoke at which people ransacked the Capitol, attacked cops, and very, very importantly, Trump gave blanket pardons to nearly everybody who was convicted, including people who were convicted of or pled out acts of violence. So Trump, who gave a 10% good, 60% not good, and 30% okay speech last night about Charlie Kirk. The part that just beggared belief was, and I wish that he meant it, was that we can't do political violence. The kind of like the constant drumbeat of demonization of others is bad, and this takes you to bad places. But then he went directly from there to saying, well, that is what is responsible for Charlie Kirk getting killed. I'm going to go after these people, but only the ones on the radical left, and etc. He pardoned violent protesters who were committing acts of violence in the name of politics on his behalf. And I think that is probably, in many ways, the single most consequential act by a sitting politician to contribute to, rather than to attempt to blunt what feels like an escalation of violence. And
let's talk. Let's talk a little bit about kind of larger background causes, or just the background setting and context of periods of heightened political violence, and then we can talk about more specific elements to it. If we're talking about the late 60s and the early 70s, what was going in there? The big background things were, among others, there was an unpopular war going on. There was an increasingly unpopular president, even though, Nixon won re-election in 72, at that point, the largest, I think the largest electoral landslide in U.S. history. He had barely squeaked into office in 68. Watergate was happening. Other stuff was happening. The economy was in tatters. There were fears about the Cold War, existential concerns about, whether it was the Cold War or various kinds of the environmental movement. There was a lot of, heightened anxiety about almost all aspects of society. Is that, race relations in particular were not good. Are these the big kind of issues that go into, the upheaval into political violence?
I think
And
part of it, and we're blind people poking at stuff with sticks when we talk about this on some level.
absolutely.
But, as someone who kind of came of age in journalism with a lot of exposure to individuals who were part of the kind of new left of the 60s and the SDS generation, like literal members of that, and who remember a lot of these
Yeah, I
stories.
mean, you and not to go down memory lane too far, but like one of your mentors was Robert Scheer,
Yes,
who was really one of the most kind of amazing characters, maybe not of new journalism per se, but of the new left and chronicling the new left and being at ramparts and at magazines that also explicitly romanced revolutionary violence. This is something that they picked up from the existentialists, and before that, the communists in places like China in the 1920s and elsewhere.
So I think from both remembering that and reading about some of how people thought in real time, a key component of it was that the people who were very, young idealists in 1964 and 1965, I went to UC Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
And they burned the bank, right, in Isla Vista in 1970. So
the
bad.
Bank of America. It was an act of anti-Italian terrorism.
I was recently with an ex-gaucho who reminded me that they reburned it in 72. Don't forget that one. I'm like, okay. But what you will hear over and over again is that people became, through the assassinations of 68, perhaps the election in 68 of Nixon, but definitely the re-election in 72, like that was sort of the nail in the coffin. They concluded that it was no longer possible to make change in the methodical America, show up, have a meeting, do a rally, and all these kind of ways. Like that was it. We had to go deeper. And there was this entire kind of dropping out of a generation of activists who are like, all right, let's do it. Let's go for it. And that is always a bad moment. And this is one of the reasons why the Charlie Kirk assassination is so haunting, in ways that I think people who are not very familiar with conservatives are really going to underrate, which is that this was Charlie Kirk's persona, besides the hair and the South Park character, which his response to that was fantastic, being depicted in the current season. But his whole persona was, I'm going to college campuses. I'm going to be the debate me bro guy. I am going to engage in all of that discourse that we're supposed to do. Ezra Klein had a piece on this in the New York Times today, basically saying he did it the right way, and then he was killed. That should be a really, really, really bad moment. And in part because, I mean, it's just on its own. It's horrifying, and for him and his family and everybody else around. But we don't want people to get so disillusioned with the plodding and inefficient and crazy American experiment to the point where it's all like secret cells meeting and arming themselves to the teeth and imagining all kinds of stuff in vacuums that don't make any sense informationally. That is also part of the story of January 6th, right? A lot of those people dropped out of even respectable anti-authoritarian societies and turned it into something weirder and more rancid.
So you think that is similar to, the classic case is the Weather Underground coming out of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society in the 60s, is, it's a bunch of, kind of clean cut, at least at the beginning in the early 60s, clean cut college kids who are, at University of Michigan and other places, and they're going to lobby for change and, through the political process. By the end of the 60s, they're like, fuck it. And they drop out into things like Red Army Faction and the Weather Underground, most famously. And they go underground in order to become terrorists. Do you think we are witnessing that on either the right or the left in a way that is analogous?
I can't imagine that it compares in that sense. I just can't. I mean, part of the weird thing about what we're living through now is I remain convinced, perhaps evidence to the contrary, that this is a bunch of very online people talking themselves into things that very few normal people believe in. If you I've been trying as hard as I can to travel around America, just even, for an afternoon in any direction outside of this godforsaken hellhole that we live in. You just are always reminded that normal people aren't out there having really stupid conversations about Luigi Mangione. Like, that's just not like part of the daily discourse. There's kind of a base level of patriotism, of normalcy, of not like having gone crazy. And so I think some of this is an online phenomenon more than it is like a gigantic phenomenon. But also there's some radicalizing things that have happened.
Right. Well, and also, what do you do? I mean,
and the Israel-Gaza war is very, very radicalizing for a lot of people on college campuses, and then their reaction or overreaction in their protest then becomes sort of radicalizing for the other side. And this is not a small thing that's happening as we speak.
No, and what is fascinating is, compared to the Vietnam War, which America was directly involved in, and where up through about 1970, or actually maybe even 71, like if you were a male between the ages of 18 and 25, you had a substantial chance of being drafted and sent, if not to Vietnam, somewhere nearby. And Israel-Gaza is important to people and important to the world, but we don't have the same engagement with it that we might. So it becomes it is like an online thing where it's not our reality. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's that, but what do we do with, one of the things that Kirk, and, this is, it's disturbing to me to see people who are saying online, oh, well, like, if you, like, if you say, I hope, I'm sad that, his kids are going to grow up without their father, like, you're a sellout or a scumbag, or, he was a horrible person. That's fucked up beyond belief. But it is also true, he was part of a culture war that had definitely turned things up, right, in terms of rhetoric. And if you look at a lot of the things he said, about Sharia law, and about how, wokeism and Marxism are coming, and like, I want to be able to raise my kids without hearing, calls to prayer 5 times a day in America. And he was a cheerful warrior, like when he showed up on college campuses and whatnot, but he also was dealing with people like Tucker Carlson, who's becoming more and more unhinged and insane, and kind of
himself
quasi-violent.
This year in particular, he separated himself from some of the less savory aspects of the right. He warned people that there was a lot of weird anti-Semitism and white supremacy going on.
Right.
And
that's where a lot of the attacks on him were coming from. I mean, people like Nick Fuentes and the kind of national racist heritage, white national American types, where, to a degree where it wouldn't be surprising if the shooter ends up being somehow associated with them rather than anybody on the left. I would not be surprised by that. But I guess what I'm getting at is, like, what about people like Stephen Miller, who is already trying to, who is politicizing this, and it is a political act, so that's fair. But when, people like Stephen Miller are talking about, kicking, people out of the country, or, like, where, again, on this background level, and I'm not saying any individual other than the people who are pulling triggers are responsible, but, like, where does, what is the role of that, do you think, in kind of heightening violent episodes? Just the background chatter.
The way that I'm trying to think about this, I think everyone, or many people, get caught up in the causation, and Trump did last night in his discussion. And again, Trump leading a national conversation about how we shouldn't use totalizing rhetoric to demonize our opponents is a real, are you fucking kidding me moment. Like, he doesn't believe it. He was retweeting images of himself being in Apocalypse Now, doing war against Chicago, I don't know, 4 days ago. He's not credible on that line. But I think people get caught up, and they have ever since, especially ever since the Gabby Giffords shooting by Jared Loughner in January of 2011. And, like, Paul Krugman saying, talking about the climate of hate that kind of produced it, and blaming it on Sarah Palin. People want to get to the causation and say, it's this rhetoric. It's the rhetoric of, it just turns out to be the rhetoric of people I hate that's causing this. Even in 2009, in the summer, which has largely been memory hold, but there was a whole spate of of absolutely freak out columns by people freaking out about the town hall meetings that Tea Party people were giving an earful to their Congress.
And the Tea Party people just yelling at their elected representatives that they sucked in town halls. That was treated as if it was
the jackboot, is how E.J. Dionne put it, and E.J. Dionne is tends to be measured about things, but it certainly wasn't then. There was a whole stream of this stuff about we're just going to see, a guy showed up in an open carry state, I think in Arizona, with a rifle at a Tea Party rally, and I'm like, oh my God, it's gone crazy. So there is this anticipatory fear and preemptive blame, and then post facto blame that turned out to be incorrect at that moment. And I think people want to kind of do that now. I think that's the wrong way of approaching it mentally, particularly when we sort of think about taking responsibility for our own actions. The way I try to think about it is, what if one believed that we are either in an era of heightened, increased political violence, or we are on the precipice of it, and we really want to stop this before it gets for. What if you actually believed it? How would you act then?
Right. And
it's my contention that if you actually believed that in a very real and sobering way, it would be impossible to escape the conclusion, unless you're just engaged in a lot of willful blindness, that if you are part of one of the two major political tendencies in this country, there are people on your own side who are part of that fucking problem. Forgive my French, Fred Young. Which is, and that if you try to say it's only, radical left violence, it's only Proud Boys, right-wing nutbags, and Donald Trump and Stephen Miller,
right,
were part of the problem, that is just going to be necessarily incomplete. And then what do? I think what you don't do is you don't do what Elon Musk did right when this happened, which is to say the left is the party of murder.
Right.
Whatever the left is,
which is an incoherent statement on like a letter by letter basis, right? It doesn't make any sense.
Stephen Miller obviously seizing the opportunity of saying, Republicans bounce again, but that there is this entire tendency in American culture that needs to be rooted out at every single molecular level, and they want the worst for everybody, and et cetera, et cetera. When you've gone down that path, you're wrong. Which should be the first thing that troubles you. The second,
if I may, also just to pile on a little bit there, Chris Rufo tweeted out that when this was happening in the late '60s and early '70s, J. Edgar Hoover shut it down immediately, and we should do that within the limits of the law. And it's like, first off, J. Edgar Hoover knew no limits. He thought he was the law, but also he died just before the spasm of violence, which the FBI was clearly involved in creating through agents provocateur. He died before it was even a spent force. So there's a lot of that kind of talk going on.
It's sort of a juvenile revisionist history, and I'm not sure that we can look back, and I haven't read my Days of Rage anytime recently, but where we can look back at the petering out of very explicitly left-wing violence in America, and not just America, but in Germany and Italy and a lot of places in the 70s. It's happening around the globe. I'm not sure we can say that ended because of vigorous FBI enforcement.
I think what about the right-wing violence that preceded the 60s in a large way, and in terms of in the 50s and through the early part of the 60s, groups like the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, and this was not evenly distributed around the country, but there were, things like, church bombings in the South, as as constant death threats and constant mobs going and beating people.
That was I don't know to what degree we say these are right wing as opposed to, a lot of those were Democrats, whether they're right or left.
Right. Well, they're nationalist, populist, and they, it was political. I don't want to get caught up in the idea of, like that right wing can never, no,
I'm
Hitler
not.
wasn't really right wing. I know you're not saying that, but I'm
about the 70s. We're talking about left wing violence. There wasn't a lot
for the most part.
There have been. There's explicit racist violence throughout the history of America, and explicit, just back to the top of the whole thing, just explicit violence. We have way too much violence in this country. We always have.
I guess what I'm getting at with that, just very briefly, is that in the 60s, the term race riot became equated with when black neighborhoods rioted. Before that, race riots were riots started by whites against blacks, and Tulsa is the great example. But throughout the 50s and the civil rights era, which then gave rise to black radicalism, right? The Black Power movement was that there was a sense that as blacks were legally being given rights, there was a counter force against them, in the South, and that's why people like Stokely Carmichael, that's after Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King and whatnot got shot, that's why they were like, okay, whatever means necessary, because this nonviolence crap doesn't work.
Yeah, and just to for those who are Chris Ruho is a little bit too young, and I don't mean any aspersions on him, but to have a sense of the depth of the horror of 1968, which is the year that I was born. Nick remembers it well. I think he graduated from college.
That's right. Yeah, I got my first PhD in 1968, man.
First of many. But you could see the damage from space of the riot-scarred inner cities after, especially Martin Luther King had been assassinated. But it was such an incredibly awful year that it beggars the imagination. And one of the things that I think we at Reason and in general, sort of the broader kind of maybe classical liberal chill out section likes to point out is that it's as bad as it is right now in any given time. It's not anywhere near 68, and it's not as nearly as bad as 77 in a lot of different places. And we should always retain our perspective. I think that's an important perspective, but also we shouldn't let that lull us to sleep. I don't want, it's just like people who draw crime rates and like, well, it's down a lot since 1990. Again, yes, great. I don't want to live in 1990, especially in New York, because that was terrifying. So like we should want to do better than all of that. And I think to get back to what is just beginning the point to make about the 70s is that some of that shit just petered out and people got older. I think that there's some resonance with the scene in or the section passage in Forrest Gump, that great American documentary, where all this crazy stuff has happened. Jen A finally dies, and Forrest is like, screw it, I'm gonna go jogging. And that's kind of what happened. America went jogging and like suddenly woke up and everyone was wearing dolphin shorts, and it was 1982 and people had perms. And
no, it was better. It was like 1984, 85, right? So we had come out of the recession and it was morning again, right?
Yeah, or just
in America,
but like even before, like it was morning, it was there was an exhaustion of where all of that sort of 60s flavored tumult that went throughout the 70s for a while got us. And then I think even the individuals who were engaged in it, like, okay, you know what, I just want a cushy professor job. I'm going to stop blowing up cops and stuff. I just just give me tenure so I can relax. So I think there is some of that can peter out, and there. I actually have a little bit of hope that our current long populist moment, which on the right is Donald Trump, on the left is Bernie Sanders, and then just everything that sort of like rumbles around, sort of like it's the Buchanan and Nader campaigns of 2000 have suddenly become major party politics in America now, which is just bizarre to me. But that it's exhausting, right, on some level, and people are going to want to vacate that and go to a different sort of tendency. I'm not banking on that, but it gives me some hope that I don't think that a majority of the population really likes this kind of crap.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that in the 70s, there's no question that there was violence and that it was being visited upon by, elements of the countercultural left. But most of the counterculture, the culture moved on to kind of internal or individual liberation, and that was sexual liberation. It was, gay rights. It was feminism. It was a reordering of the family. Not always easy to, kind of navigate that, but it was not. It was a moving away from politics to say that I'm focusing on the personal now. And I think, ultimately we were a much better country for that. I mean, we talked about that in the Declaration of Independence a bit. Like the 70s is a vital decade, partly because by the end of it, people were freer. I hate to channel Marlo Thomas and Rosie Greer, but like they were free to be you and me. Like they could be who they wanted to be. and that was a better society, but then we're still stuck with the fact that relatively few people who are violent can really radically alter, the direction of society or the tenor of the times for a while. If we may, go ahead.
I think an important backdrop, and again, this contributes to our sense of that there's something wrong now, is that we do see, regardless of violence, we do see a wide-scale abandonment by whole sections of the two major political blocs in this country of the kind of the process of the guardrails. Like, we got to get rid of the filibuster, we got to pack the court. This sort of plodding classical liberal David French way of going out there. No, that's not producing results. This is exactly how you get Charlie Kirk killed, and there's going to be a response to this. And I'm more sympathetic than one might normally expect of people who are like, hey, we tried to do it the good way, and the person who's the avatar of that got killed. Now what? So people have given up on a certain amount of liberalism, on the Enlightenment, some of them explicitly feel, and the sort of the Mencius mold bug right. So that abandonment of this sort of George Will Madisonian project is distressing, because then you start looking for shortcuts, you start looking for sticks with which to punish your enemies, and you stop caring about dividing up power and to have a little bit of sand in the gears of having whoever is running the country do whatever they want. And that's part of it, I think, why we think that this is a bad moment.
Do you think that is primarily a function of attitudes on the right? I'm thinking, just a few days ago, and this is before the Kirk killing, J.D. Vance, when he was talking about blowing up the that boat in, from Venezuela that was supposedly, carrying deadly drugs to America, and it was an act of war. He, basically said then and says, consistently, like, fuck your process. We have to do what's right, and I mean, like, there's a whole strain of thinking that is both in power on the right that says due process is for losers, right? And they're constantly challenging that.
I agree with that, and we write a lot about that at Reason, and Stephanie Slade does about the politics, and everybody does about various aspects of the legalities and constitutional aspects, and we've done this for a very long time now. But there's a lot of impatience on the left too. I mean, Joe Biden, just like, we're going to forgive student loans with the stroke of a pen. It's like, what? There is a whole lot of discussion about things like court packing. Did they do it? They didn't do it necessarily, but we've also, effectively tripled the size of government in 25 years. A lot of times, moments of crisis, with lots of enthusiasm from Democrats who stopped pretending to care that you can't just borrow forever. Like, screw it, we can. All of that kind of is an expression of impatience with the plodding stuff of government. Is it equal? It's not for me to judge. And right now, Democrats are not in power. They have, I think, more power in cultural institutions. So I can understand the sort of the feeling that is a more difficult thing for people who are not kind of Democrat oriented to deal with in civilian life. And so they get impatient, want to use the tools of government to kind of combat that.
But what is different now is, I think, I think part of it is that, people in the government are explicitly saying, like, fuck it, we're going to do what we're going to do. Right. In a way that, even Biden, was making claims that, he could do this through OSHA, like he could freeze rents or evictions and things like that. And, one could argue
evictions got frozen under Donald Trump.
Under Trump. Yeah. No, I mean, this is where Trump, was it Jeb Bush who called him the chaos candidate back in 2000, the 2016 campaign, but he really is. What I want to do is go to a couple of questions or comments in the YouTube section. Let's answer those. And then I want to ask you, Matt, in our final, we're going to be out of here in about 20 minutes. How do we make sure that this kind of violence does not become the new normal? But before we do that, we have a person, S Cup 122, writes that AOC framed Charlie Kirk's killing as a gun control issue while many on the right call it an issue of political violence with open support by some leftists. What do libertarians add to this debate?
I mean,
any ideas?
Like Democrats have been responding to every act of gun violence as a question of guns since forever. Libertarians annoy people by pointing out that the Second Amendment is an individual right as adjudicated by the Supreme Court. And so there are 350 million guns in America. And I don't know that you have one. AOC has a plan for doing anything constructive about that. And also, if we just sort of like guess based on all recent high profile shootings, for most of them, the majority of people got their guns legally. It's difficult.
Yeah. They followed all the rules that are in place that are, supposed to. And I'll point out, as Jacob Solomon, a recent colleague, did in a recent conversation with me, Donald Trump has been stripped of his rights to legally own guns because he's a convicted felon. Even though his crime was a white collar crime, there's a huge amount of dispossession of, people's legal gun rights in America that are clearly have nothing to do with, making the country a safer place. It's basically telling people who have not committed any kind of violence that they can have guns. But having said that, I mean, is the libertarian response to this, basically that what we need to do is to, continue to push for peaceful discourse, peaceful protest, peaceful reform, as a definite, because I've also seen people both on the left and the right basically saying, like, if you are, when one side hits with violence, if you, turn the other cheek, you're just going to get, bitch slapped into irrelevance.
Part of our counsel, I think, is frustratingly for some people longer term rather than shorter term. But one of our long-term warnings for a long time is that you keep expanding, especially the federal government. That means that everyone's attention gets turned toward what's happening in Washington. All politics becomes national obsessions. And that's not healthy for governance. It's not healthy for politics or anything else. I mean, if I walk down the street, I live in Brooklyn right now, and knocked on the door and asked people to name who their city council person is, they're not going to know. She literally has an office right around the corner from us with her name on it. And they're not going to know. But as I've mentioned before in other contexts, the day in 2017, when very soon after Betsy DeVos got confirmed to be education secretary, they had a candlelight vigil in the local elementary school that my daughter goes to, just to protest how awful it is that Betsy DeVos will do this. This is sort of like, it's national politics in the brain. It is my contention, I think our contention, that when you federalize everything and grossly grow the government to such a degree where now you have a president who's like, crime is bad in X city, so I'm just going to send in National Guard troops over the wishes of the mayor and the governor.
Right.
You're just nationalizing every issue. That means everyone is hepped up at all times about national politics and figures. That can't be healthy. And it's like it's a singular fixation on these things. If you make government and the people who run it less important and less powerful, and if you have
but how do we do that in the sense of, if Trump, we're both in New York, if Trump sends troops to New York City, what do we do? Do we light a candle and curse the darkness? Do we protest? You trying
to get me here? I'm gonna get you on what's the word for it? Incitement. Nick Gillespie trying to incite me to what you and I would do is criticize it vociferously in wherever we can. It's bad. It's wrong. Shouldn't do it. Regardless of how poorly New York or other cities are governed. There's, Washington, D.C. is a separate example because of its unique and uniquely awful governing structure. Federal government has responsibility. No, it's just to boringly insist on having a separation of politics and governance. And to make that case again and again, there's going to be a day, I'm telling you people right now, there is going to be a day when a whole bunch of stuff is going to go up in flames one way or the other, either literal or metaphorical or whatever. The Social Security is going to be a mandatory 23% haircut overnight in 6 or 7 years. Something will come to focus the attention. And there will be a moment when a lot of people, not just in government, but especially outside of government, like, who has been talking about something different than all of this? And that is a moment where our work will not have been in vain. Not just to lower the temperature, sometimes to raise the temperature against things that need to burn a little bit, not physically, but that we shouldn't sit back and blithely tolerate. I think that part of the problem of the populist moment that we live in right now is that people blithely tolerate some really, really poor behavior and rhetoric also from sitting politicians of all sorts. And I think standing up athwart that and telling it to go
populism is a mob, and mobs are easily gulled into violence, or a couple of people in that, and that's worth that's really worth kind of considering and thinking about. And that you can have incredibly insightful and even heated rhetoric, but when you are doing it to populist ends and then you're calling people out on the street, like, weird shit's going to happen, and it's really good. Let me just run through a couple. Chase Oliver, the 2024 Libertarian presidential candidate, says, "I'm a firm believer that we will be okay, but I worry about entering into a 1968 style moment. The 70s kind of sucked, kind of, but not really." Chuck Robinson writes, "Does Charlie Kirk moment equal Charlie Hebdo moment?" I don't know what that means.
Please tell me it's not you,
Chuck.
Robinson?
Chuck Robinson.
I maybe to work with him. I mean, on some level, very much yes, in that it was someone known for a certain type of out front expression. I'm expressing myself in the public arena. That's what I'm doing and why. Charlie Hebdo we are provocateurs, or we are critics of absolutely everybody and everything, and we don't care who you are, and we're not going to give you special treatment and not criticize you. They wore it, and they wore it even after getting firebombed, and they got murdered for it. So there's a way in which that is the case. I think there's a bunch of other things involved with Charlie Hebdo that don't apply, specifically the cowardice of the international and American press afterwards to basically be
large parts of it
be cowed to ever post an image that might offend a Muslim. That's their response to it's basically the terrorist veto, and it's really, really horrible.
Well, here let's shift into a discussion of, okay, how do we kind of how do we lower the the pressure? I'm searching for all shitty metaphors of, like, how do we turn down the heat? How do we lower the the cabin pressure, et cetera, on kind of violence and whatnot? But do you think that there has been a general failure in U.S. society, and let's not even worry about Europe at this point, but starting sometime in the teens, the 2000 teens, where like people were like, when you think about it, like stuff like free speech and open expression, the ideals that made America. And I'm not talking about like bullshit right-wing ones where it's like George Washington was great, everybody was great, and if you bring up slavery, you're a communist. But like, where people have lost faith in the idea that, no, America is working hard to peacefully allow lots of different people to live and work together. We abandoned that. And you see that, after the George Floyd moment, which is horrific and is an act of violence, which I don't think can be willed away. Like a lot of people are like, well, we don't want to talk about it anymore. But, we don't believe in the idea that free speech is a positive thing. That peaceful disagreement is possible and preferable. We don't believe that, like, like trans, let's say trans adults should have equal rights as anybody else in society. And you can disagree with that, but, like without becoming either, somehow where all trans rights, including, in vitro, fetuses have the same rights as adults, or that, you have to ban anybody who is at all alternative to whatever some kind of weird right-wing Christian mainstream is. I mean, a roundabout way, and I'm sorry I'm blathering on here, but like, have we lost faith, Matt Welch, in the core beliefs that underpin, liberal America?
Too many of us have. I don't know if we have at a capital, in the country, but way too many of us have. And a lot of it is the sort of the free speech abandonment culturally. It's now very much of a bipartisan thing that we saw really spike up around 2014. And there's also a pessimism that came with kind of the sort of 1619 project left, woke, or use a better word for that, of that, all of the good stuff that we point to, the founding yumminess, the Declaration of Independence, not the stuff about the Indian savages, but the all men are created equal part. Basically that's all a scam by white men to keep people down, and we should sort of puncture holes in that. And when people sort of began to lose that faith in American insights and the things that we do so much better than damn England these days, certainly, then that's a problem. And hopefully things like the Graham Linehan arrest in the UK can scare us straight, hopefully. And there's no reason to hope for this, but like, I want to hope for it, so I will hope for it, that like we have a micro moment right now where people go, oh my God, we just shot a dude in the neck for being on campus. What are we even doing here? All the people who, words are violence. Like, no, actually, violence is violence. Words are words. And let's figure out how to separate those things out. And then there's a whole bunch of other associated things besides. But there's undergirding all of this is sort of an apocalyptic, howling pessimism, again, on the left and the right. You see it's Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Donald Trump came in our lives and said that, the country, we don't even have a country anymore. I mean, using this type of stuff. The Flight 93 election was the classic Michael Anton way of thinking about 2016. We analogizing what we're doing right now into, if we do just elect Hillary Clinton, which I was not in favor of doing, that's the same as letting terrorists run a plane into maybe the Capitol building. It's insane. So we have to kind of, to have a retethering of kind of basic analytical like normalcy here. So that's, well, I mean,
there's a very strange moment where, in many ways, the material reality in America, and by that I mean like, where people live, what kind of food they eat, what kind of jobs they have, like, it's going well. Median household income is, even with, tariffs and regulations and, this and that and all that, like, things are good. They're not perfect. They can always be better, and there are real problems.
But the people running the country and the people who have cultural power have been super annoying, and they've screwed up everything over and over.
No, I agree. No, I'm not saying, but it's also to
that. I think that, but I say that in response because I think that's a lot of the response. Like, you can on paper say that we continue to march upwards and have separated ourselves even from the kind of median wealth of Western Europe, as a recent cover story documents and all of that.
Right.
But something doesn't feel right. And part of what doesn't feel right is the screw ups and also the attitudes from people in power. And I understand that. And I share quite a bit.
Well, we're also being, both the right and the left, and it's not just Trump, but, Trump and Hillary Clinton, both in 2016, literally said the system is rigged. You're getting ripped off. You're not being treated right. And that this is the constant refrain of both the right and the left. And, even as Democrats and Republicans lose, kind of mind share, even if everybody's voting for them, people believe the stories that they're being told by political leaders, which is that these are monstrous times. These are horrible times, and your kid is going to be kidnapped and transitioned, or you are, or they're going to be farmed off to some kind of Christian nationalist camp, and they're going to come back and hate you, hate both of their mothers and things like that. And I don't think we should be surprised when this affects the way people feel. But I guess my question then is like, we need to retether to reality and away from extremism, right? That is fanciful.
And also,
but how do we do that? How do we do that, Matt Welch?
I think in personal and private lives and conversation is just to always insist on not letting politics doom things, not like the perennial New York Times or New York Magazine piece of like, how do we talk to our relatives at Thanksgiving this year?
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Like, be a human first. Always be a human first. And don't wake up in the morning try to convince everybody about every last thing in politics. Even if you do it professionally, like have a personal zone in your life and never lose that sense of perspective. When you get to the point of where you convince yourself that even 30% or 40% or 50% of America is irredeemable, is actively trying to do horrible things, you need to go take a walk, sir or madam. You just need to take a walk, because that's not the case. It's just not. That's not how people wake up in the morning. We have some, regnant, I don't know what regnant means, but it sounded right in that place.
That sounds pretty good.
Cultural attitudes here in America that are just kind of weird and interesting and fun, and endure regardless of temporal politics. And temporal politics have been very bad in many other eras as well. Don't forget that. But like, go take a walk. That is not the majority of the country ever, ever, ever. And when you're using that kind of group demonization, you're analyzing things wrong, and you're talking yourself into some pretty ugly kind of illiberal moves that go against our kind of constitutional history and just basically due process and free speech and all the stuff that we're supposed to be better at.
Are you more depressed? I mean, I remember, in the late aughts, or, at the end of the Bush years, which were 8 years that were, in profound ways, were terrible. We had a government that was secretly funding a war, without doing it in the open for the first multiple years of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, that lied its way into that, either, on purpose or by accident. They conned themselves and they conned the country into doing that. They blew out all kind of restraint on spending on the federal government domestically. And then came the Great Recession, which was largely a function of government interventions into the economy. And we had that spectacle of George Bush saying he was going to save capitalism by suspending it, at the end of his term, and then it was taken up by. I feel like, both you and I both recognize the seriousness of that moment. Like, this was not good, and it was terrible. We called it out. We talked about how, it's always darkest before the dawn of the libertarian moment, a phrase that both was scorned but also ended up circulating, not simply ironically. Were you more optimistic then, or is that just a function of youth, or is it like, how do we recapture that kind of optimism? Because I think that somehow that kind of feeling okay, even when it's pretty dark out, is part of how we get back to a reality that is not your choice is between deranged Luigi Mangione supporters and, Stephen Miller in the White House, like, where you realize that these people are living in fantasy worlds that are psychotically deranged, and it's their problem. It's not the world's problem.
The day that, or the month that Donald Trump escalated into our lives, into our lives, and said that Mexico is sending the rapists, and then the next round of polls saw him shoot way up in the polls, and saw every one of his Republican competitors, including Rand Paul, start just scrambling, including Jeb Bush, who had written pro-immigration books, scrambling to come up with something that looked immigration restrictionist. Suddenly everyone's like, birthright citizenship, no more anchor babies. Ben Carson wanted to seal the border, not just north and south, but east and west. That was my favorite.
No.
Hey, put super glue on the coast. All right, look, fine. I'm not kink shaming.
No, we'll build a wall. We'll build a wall in Europe and Asia. We'll pay for it.
So in that moment, when you could see that National Front style politics could actually work, politics that were, Vladimir Mečiar style politics can actually be popular in America. That was a day of not just pessimism, but like I didn't think that could happen in a country that I was in. To a lesser degree, some of the flirtation with Bernie Sanders and his success was like that too. Although he's somehow he's more affable in his absolute nonsense.
He certainly is not calling for, the wide scale deportation or imprisonment of people, right?
Right. It's a different, but at the same time, he's also calling for a lot of things that we've had that I don't like, which is high tariffs and this
insane labor laws and
the bottom and all that kind of stuff. But it was especially that moment with Trump when he said, okay, well, you can do national front style politics in America. That meant not only that I had to recalibrate my understanding of America, but I also had to recalibrate, and hopefully a lot of people who work in our industry have to recalibrate. Like, what are we doing? What do we get wrong about the import and the impact of what we do? None of which is very pleasant. Part of it is since that moment, I realized we're going to be in a really long period of time, and hopefully and we can add some value and some perspective that people will find of actual value, or at least they can ameliorate some of the pain at various times. Like it can be refreshing to be okay. I'm in the total minority now again for a long time, and that's fine. That's like my job, our job. But part of it too is that I weep for our country. It's a bad. I knew it's going to be a bad era. It's been a bad era for the last 10, 12 years, and it wasn't fantastic before.
Do you think that the economic failure, and it's complicated to say exactly what that means, but the economic failure of Trump's agenda, which is a populist agenda, and elements of it are shared by the right and the left and whatnot, but like, will that be enough to kind of do the reboot we need, if not the reboot we deserve, where you pull away from a kind of lunatic fantasy on the part of Trump and a kind of populist right that like we can control everything that's going on in the country. We can regulate stuff. We can decide who's here, who's not. We're gonna, in the most insane version of this, RFK Jr., who is like walking through airports and diagnosing children. What the fuck is he? Is he like some kind of superhero? It's like, oh, you have palsy, you have diabetes. Yeah, mitochondrial distress. But then on the other side, we have this moment of generational shift that is happening where, is Zoran Mamdani and the idea that like he alone can govern the New York economy and the housing market and things like that. Is it just, are we stuck going back and forth between these two weird extremes that are ultimately, I think, lunatic fantasies of total control from a political power position, to people getting to a point where like, oh yeah, what works better is, free minds and free markets where we don't have to love everything that we're seeing around us, but we got to give it a little bit of space. And I want more control over my life, and damn it, like, okay, I'll grant you a little bit more control over yours. I
think that while obviously not having the answer to that question, I think there are two things that I feel more confident in predicting. One is that sometime in the next 6 to 8 years, likely sooner, there's going to be a catastrophe the size of which exceeds most of our imagination. We already had a lot of things that have exceeded our imagination. January 6th exceeded our imagination. COVID exceeded our imagination and the response.
I think the financial crisis did in a profound way.
Maybe not quite, but it was big. It's certainly big. So there will be some kind of crisis that will force people to think differently about politics and responses. So that could be a good, lead to people turning in a good direction, can also lead to something in a bad direction. But that will force some kind of rethink. The other thing, and I think is currently quite underrated, is that the era of Donald Trump's really unique and on some level earned political potency, we can start counting in months. We are one midterm election away from the spell that he's cast that is so strong that 50 senators voted for a heroin addict Kennedy, insane person, to be like head of HHS. Sure, why not? People are just terrified of Trump and of Trump's voters, and of crossing him in any way, shape, or form. I think that spell gets a bit broken after the midterm elections.
Yeah, one way or another, right?
One way or the other. And so that is going to change. I think at some point there is going to be a cascade, a preference defalsification cascade. A lot of people who've been pretending a lot of things, or more likely who've just been sitting on their hands and just not saying a word about stuff that they know is bad, both comportmentally, but also on the policy level, are going to change and go into another direction and start saying other things. That I won't respect them even a tiny little bit more, and I wish all of them to be.
But
fired.
You don't now either, right? So it's
that is true. I don't now either. So I think that some combination of those two things is going to radically change the way that we think about that particular question. Probably in ways that are kind of difficult to predict, because all things that are that large, our little brains can't comprehend, or at least mine.
I mean, I will, and we'll close with this, but I think back to a conversation that I had with my parents at one point, who were born in the 20s, grew up in immigrant households in the 20s, were poor. Then the Depression hit, and they were really poor. My father fought in World War II. And when that ended, I remember them both telling me once, they were like, okay, well, at least the mass killing will stop, but we'll still be poor, because that's just what happens. And then by like around 1950, a variety of things had happened where, people started gaining wealth at all levels, like society got better. And America went from being a relatively poor country to being a relatively wealthy country. And, and they stopped thinking about the old ways of doing things. And they were informed by it, and in many ways crippled by it, other times energized by it, and not just them, but all of America. And, to me, that question is like, how do we get from 1945 to 1950? How do we get from 1979 to 1984? Because, Reagan was, until like about 83, like he had one termer written all over his fucking, oily face. And, and things changed. And part of it is policy. There's no question about that. But then there's something that is independent of that just, where a reboot starts. And I mean, Matt, I think this is something that you and I are obviously groping towards, or working towards in our work at Reason, and our colleagues at Reason. Like, what are the things that will help trigger that, where we leave this timeline behind, and we're not going to fix it. We're not going to solve it. We're not going to make it a better. Like, we have to get to the next plot, like to the next season. And, I hope we can come up with that. A final thought from Matt Welch.
Just that, as we used to say in the 80s, perestroika begins in the home. So like, the change that you want to see begins in the mirror. And I firmly believe that. Like, if you want to see better behavior comportment, policy, everything, but especially kind of behavior among your politicians, insist on it. Like, don't get blasé about people lying or abusing power in this direction, and don't immediately go to your whataboutism game. Like, oh, but Biden did this or Trump did this.
Yeah.
It's just like, no, that's bad. It's okay to say that's bad, and also to laugh about it while you're doing it. And be nice and don't be a jerk to people because of politics.
The minute you mentioned Glasnost, I think of Mikhail Gorbachev, and then I think of Pizza Hut. And I recently posted an old Pizza Hut ad that showed up in one of my timelines, which was, I think it was Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, who advertised a Pizza Hut, like some kind of outlaw pizza. I don't know if that meant the cheese was
right on there
or whatever, but like, when you think back to where the world was at various points and how utterly insane, and, there was no way forward, and, we tend to find a way. So hopefully we'll find one sooner rather than later, and more peaceful rather than more violent. But right now we're going to call it quits. Matt Welch of Reason and of the Fifth Column, thank you so much for joining me. And I will see you soon, I'm sure.
Thank you, Nick Gillespie.
Okay. And thanks everybody for listening to the Reason interview. Please subscribe to this, subscribe to the Reason Roundtable, subscribe to everything that is free and valuable in the world. Thanks again. And